I think we'll get started. I'm Kate Seeley with the Middle East Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and I want to thank our fine panelists and our moderator Marvin Weinbaum for their time and their insights. Today marks the first in a series of 5 panels and lectures on Afghanistan and Pakistan that MEI will be programming with the support, thanks to the support of MEI board member Lou Hughes. So unfortunately he could not join us today, but I want to thank Mr. Hughes for his contribution to promoting this discussion about the future of these two countries and their linkage, and of course we'll be keeping you posted about upcoming panels. So thank you once again for joining us, and now I'd like to hand it over to moderator Marvin Weinbaum.
Thank you, Kate. There's, it seems to me, confusion in this country over whether there is a political solution to the Afghan conflict, whether it's achievable. There's no question that few would doubt that it's desirable that there be a compromise reached that would be inclusive not only of the Taliban and their allies, but also of all of the major political actors and factions in Afghanistan. There's disagreement, though, over whether the interlocutors or potential interlocutors here are sincere, whether incentives exist to bring about a sustainable agreement. Can negotiations be facilitated, and if so, how? Could they be concluded any time in the near future? Are there principles which would have to be, to some extent, compromised or sacrificed? These and other questions have been asked for some time. Last week we saw many of them raised prominently in the national press. First, there was an article in the New York Times that suggested that U.S. officials have lost any hope of progress. It was followed almost immediately by an editorial in the same newspaper that urged greater persistence towards initiating talks. And that very same day, David Ignatius, writing in the Washington Post, laid out a possible roadmap and berated the presidential candidates for not discussing how this conflict could be brought to a conclusion. Well, are we failing to grasp the opportunities for reconciliation, or are we desperately grasping for straws as we look to make our exit? Are the Taliban sending signals that are being ignored, or are they simply playing for time and strategically and ideologically perhaps not disposed toward any kind of compromise? To help us sort out these questions, what's realistic and what's illusionary, we've asked 3 people who have followed this reconciliation closely to join us this afternoon. Their credentials suggest that they can bring a deeper understanding to what is occurring and what might occur in the near future. Their views will undoubtedly differ, but this is not meant to be a debate. It's rather an exploration of this subject that demands greater clarity, because here in the United States and elsewhere the stakes are so high. I'm going to ask the first of the speakers, Ambassador Omar Samad, in just a moment to step forward. You have biographical statements, do you? Yes. Well, let me just mention quickly, though, he has been the Afghan ambassador in France, to France and to Canada, and a spokesperson for the Foreign Ministry. And he's currently an Afghan expert at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador Samad, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Weinbaum. Happy to be here today and to discuss an issue that you call high-stakes issue. And since I've been told that we have about 13 minutes, I will try to use that time as adequately as possible and try to make the points that I have, and then I know that we have some time for discussion and hopefully lots of questions. So the question that has been posed is whether there is a political solution to the Afghan conflict. It's an important question, a timely one in my opinion, and I am here to offer an Afghan perspective, not an Afghan government perspective or a political party perspective, but just what I think, following the events in my country and being in touch with and visiting as much as I can, what overall Afghan political elites especially think, regardless of their affiliations, about this very, very important, critical question of how and whether it's possible to solve this conflict. Now, what I will start with, if you don't mind, is spend a minute or two on this question of what is the Afghan conflict. I mean, is this an insurgency that we're experiencing? Is this a civil war, a continuation of civil war? Is this a proxy-driven conflict that has other actors involved? Is this over resources, as some people claim? Is this as a result of geopolitical rivalries and strategic priorities? Unresolved historic issues and regional historic issues? Is this ethnic warfare, as some people think it is? Is this just a question of anti-terrorism? And I don't think that there is anyone who can point to any one answer to this question of conflict in Afghanistan. But from the Afghan perspective, they look at it with a historic vision. They go back to the time when there was no conflict, and that is about 34 years ago, almost 35 years ago, when Afghanistan had experienced at least 3 generations of stability and peace and some sort of development of one way or the other, including a decade of democratic experimentation in the 1960s and constitutional order from the 60s to the 70s. So for an Afghan, that backdrop is important in order to make sense to what happened to them and to their country. The first shock was the communist coup, followed by the Soviet invasion, an occupation that cost the Afghans very dearly in terms of lives. No one knows, but at least 1 million Afghans perished during that period of time. The country was decimated. Everything that my father and grandfather's generations had worked on was destroyed, from institutions to infrastructure to human capital. This started back then and continued until a decade ago, when we tried to sort of take advantage of the changeover and make up for times that were lost. So then it was followed by a resistance, a national resistance. Some people called it jihad, some people called it a national struggle. We were called freedom fighters and so on and so forth, to make sure that the Soviets were defeated. And we jointly accomplished that, with the US and many others joining that struggle in a very covert manner, but still very effective manner. But what happened during this period, I just want to point to 2 things that are very much relating to today's situation. One, a certain school of thought. Some people call it Islamic radicalism, others call it extremism, others call it Wahhabism. In different forms, came to this part of the world and was installed and found a home in what is today the tribal regions of Pakistan, and at some point it was the tribal regions of Afghanistan. It still is, but they are no longer there anymore. And they were able to inject themselves in the geopolitical scene, and later on took the form of terrorist groups. The other issue was that our neighbors, especially Pakistan and Iran, being very good hosts to millions of Afghans, and I have to admit and always be thankful for that, also had their own agendas. And their own agendas included using extremism for their grand strategy vis-a-vis India and their grand strategy vis-a-vis Central Asia. So Iran, having undergone a revolution, an Islamic revolution, was on a different path, and Pakistan, being led by an Islamist general, Ziaul Haq, was also on a new path. And these two paths sort of met in Afghanistan and shaped the future of Afghanistan to a large extent, to this day. So what we are seeing to this day also is not just a clash between Iran and Afghanistan per se, but proxy agendas at work, and proxy elements at work for certain agendas. And what Afghans are trying to do, using any means that they have at their disposal, is to send a message to these players today that the game has changed, the world has changed, we need to engage on different terms, and we need to engage with a set of a paradigm that is no longer rooted in the use of extremism and radicalism and militias under any name and banner that do the bidding on behalf of somebody else. And the battleground has become Afghanistan. So the Soviets defeated, the West lost interest, left a void, a political void in the region. And that political void was filled by all these elements that had grown in our neighborhood and inside Afghanistan as well. And the Afghans were unable to reach some type of political consensus, an agreement, and they became tools, some of them became tools in the hands of regional agendas. And to this day we see that at play again. And so the only chance, the only opportunity that presented itself later on after the civil war and the takeover by the Taliban and the arrival of Al-Qaeda and the takeover of Afghanistan by Al-Qaeda was what happened at post 9/11, unfortunately. Post 9/11, an unfortunate event, a tragic event, also was an opening, a realization that having forgotten and having ignored Afghanistan was at everybody's cost, and it cost very dearly. So one of the lessons is we should not repeat any of these things that happened in the past. We should make sure that the negligence, the bad strategies, the sort of half-cooked policies, and losing sight of what really is a priority in the past does not reoccur again in the future. That is, I guess, one of the lessons of what the last 35 years of Afghan history, again from an Afghan perspective. So when we talk about, having talked about conflict, to the Afghan, this is the context within which it's defined. Yes, of course, as a result of 30 years of conflict, there have been certain lines drawn in Afghanistan's society, ethnic lines, factional lines, linguistic lines, and so on. But I will submit to you as an Afghan that those lines are shallow. They do not run deep, and do not make up, create an Afghan problem that cannot be resolved. I think that at the end of the day, the people of Afghanistan, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion, regardless of language and region, have a sense of an identity, a national identity, and a sense of history, and a sense of belonging to a nation state. It is not a country that was just created 60 years ago. It is not a society that just came about out of nowhere. It has been there for thousands of years, and I think it will continue to be there for thousands of years. So that's why I am not of the belief that Afghanistan is going to collapse, as we just heard yesterday, day before yesterday, from the ICG report. I don't think it's Afghanistan that's going to collapse. I think that a government might face problems, and we may face a lot of challenges, but the country is not going to collapse, and Afghan society, as strong as it is going to cope with it, and we hope that it will cope with it in peaceful manners, and that the country is not going to go back and regress back into a violent situation. The other question that needs to be asked is, what do we talk about when we talk about political solution? What do we mean by political solution? Political solution can take on different forms, as Marvin sort of alluded to. Is this an intra-Afghan decision that has to be taken? Is this a regional solution that has to be sought? Or does this go beyond the region and needs international input? Again, the Afghan perspective is all three. You need the Afghan dynamic to allow the political process to move towards a solution. You need a regional dynamic that will, at the least, at the minimum, not be a hindrance and not be an obstacle to finding a solution, at the minimum. And we do realize that some of their maybe mutually acceptable interests can be resolved or can be negotiated in one way or the other. And we need to pursue that path with our neighbors if we have issues with them. And then there's an international component to all of this, and the Afghans believe that without the continued engagement and commitment of the international community, especially countries like the United States and others, we are not going to be able to make much advancement on the other two fronts. So how do we strategize this? How do we make this? How do we synergize this? And how do we put them on a complementary path and align them in such a manner that we, by let's say 2015, can say, well, there's hope now. There's really hope for, on one hand, political reconciliation, and on the other hand, political transition to new power in Afghanistan, the elections that are supposed to take place. So these are the two main challenges on the political front, and they are not mutually exclusive of each other, and they have to be thought out, and they have to be strategized as two components of one program. I don't know how much more time do I have, but 2 minutes, okay. So what needs to be done for the foreseeable future is to look at the period between now, today, should have been yesterday, but let's say today, and 2015, the end of the NATO engagement in Afghanistan, as the last window of opportunity to get this right. There is not going to be another window of opportunity for a long time to come, in my lifetime at least, if we get it wrong. And that is why it is so essential and so critical for the international community, the leadership, your political leaderships in the United States is going through its own political transition, very important in some ways, because the Afghans are looking at what may be happening in the United States in terms of any policy shifts. But at least we know a few things. NATO is going to withdraw by the end of 2014. I don't think that is going to change. There is going to be an Afghan political transition no matter what. And I think Karzai made it clear again 2 days ago when he said, I am not going to stay a day beyond 24, the date, the election date. And that he will go ahead with transitioning, which is good news, and we should welcome that. But it's also a question of how are we going to transition? How legitimate is it going to be? How credible is it going to be? And to the Afghans, that is absolutely critical, that we do not want a repeat of 2009, and we want to make sure that the Afghans feel empowered to decide their own destiny. The question that comes up is, what do you do with the Taliban? How do you deal with the security threats that exist? What will be the security situation between now and the end of 2014? How many people will be disenfranchised in Afghanistan and would not be able to vote? Which communities would be able to participate and which ones would not be? And what do you do with that? Those are some really tough questions that we need to find answers to. My hope is that between now and then, the reconciliation process would be advanced to a stage where the Taliban understand that as Afghan citizens, they will have the same equal rights as any other Afghan, and they can run for office, they can be part of the political process, and be inclusive and included in the Afghan experimentation. If they do not follow that recipe, that means that they have other things on their mind and that they're following a different agenda, and for that we need a plan B. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. Shamila Chowdhury is currently an analyst with the Eurasia Group and a senior fellow at the New America Foundation. She's been the director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council and has worked in the State Department on its policy planning staff. So, Shamila?
Thank you, Marvin. I've timed this to being exactly 10 minutes, so I hope I don't go over. I appreciate Ambassador Samad's comments, and you'll notice, I think, in the course of our discussion that there are many more questions than we have answers, which shows just how complex this situation is. And hopefully, I'll focus on a couple of things which can provide some clarity on two particular issues that I've been focusing on. And as Marvin said, I did come from the U.S. government. I spent 12 years there. So my perspective today is based on a former policymaker, someone who was charged with working on U.S.-Pakistan relations at the State Department, and then went over to the National Security Council, where I was responsible for focusing on national security, counterterrorism issues in Afghanistan and Pakistan more specifically. So my perspectives are based on this fundamental tension that exists right now in the U.S. government, where a U.S.-Pakistan relationship is really important for long-term stability in the region, especially when it comes to Afghanistan and issues of reconciliation. But the counterterrorism objectives and interests that the U.S. is pursuing in the region often limit how far we can pursue that engagement with Pakistan. So hopefully I can provide more insight into that. Today's question, is there a political solution to the Afghan conflict, may seem like an obvious one to all of us. All wars have to end either by military defeat or negotiation, and since the war in Afghanistan has been dragging on for over 10 years, it only seems logical that military defeat option should be abandoned for the more pragmatic political approach. But accepting that view has not come easy, and I see two reasons for why that's the case. The first one being that U.S. internal politics have actually limited efforts to broker a peace deal with the Taliban, and the second reason being that Pakistan, the interests and role of Pakistan specifically, have yet to be fully articulated and addressed. I think these two are fairly controversial topics, which is why I like to talk about them, and there is also a lot of confusion surrounding them. So let's talk about the U.S. internal politics angle first. In the beginning of the war, the U.S. didn't differentiate between Taliban and Al-Qaeda. This prevented the Taliban from being seen as a political entity with negotiable interests. And I don't think that that's a surprise to anyone. The Taliban was fairly ideological. Al-Qaeda was living in Afghanistan, so that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. But we now know that following the September 11th attacks, the Taliban leadership was divided somewhat over its links to Al-Qaeda. We also know that the U.S. and others in the international community didn't acknowledge some early signs of Taliban willingness to negotiate. But in the end, none of this really mattered because the Taliban was considered a terrorist organization which was harboring Al-Qaeda. And the U.S. didn't negotiate with terrorists under any circumstances. So given this history, I actually think that recent American efforts to craft a peace deal with the Taliban are rather revolutionary, and the government should be given credit for pursuing something that is extremely controversial. But since the early days of the Obama administration, this issue to pursue a political solution in Afghanistan has faced serious obstacles. We all saw what happened to then Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Richard Holbrooke. His single mission was to broker a peace deal with the Taliban, and he was doing everything he could to make sure we would go down that path. But he wasn't able to garner the bureaucratic and political support to do so. Something that's not talked about as much publicly is the fact that NATO Commander Stanley McChrystal was also personally involved in some nascent outreach meetings to the Taliban, but he was forced to resign after the controversial Rolling Stone article that we all know about. So I give these two guys a lot of credit, actually, for socializing the American civilian and military circles on the topic of reconciliation. But now they're gone, and the challenges are proving to be bigger than the personalities involved. The efforts to socialize the topic remain fairly limited within a small group of policymakers, which we should expect with such a sensitive topic. But most of the information on reconciliation should be classified, but regular leaks through the media have given us all insights on what's going on. These leaks have angered Congress, which continues to ask for details about this process. And if Congress is supposed to approve billions of dollars of aid to Pakistan and Afghanistan for the future, it's only logical to assume that they would want to be consulted on these negotiations and issues associated with them, even though they don't all require congressional approval. So that's another gap in the administration's outreach or socialization of this topic. The communication has improved with Congress. I think the administration has done a good job of educating them more, but Congress is still they still disagree with some controversial confidence-building measures that are critical for a peace process political solution to move forward, namely the transfer of Taliban detainees from Guantanamo and the endorsement of a political office for the Taliban outside of Afghanistan. Similar, like Congress, the U.S. military has also found it difficult to get on board with reconciliation. We all know that the strategy is fight, talk, and build. That hasn't changed, but pursuing the talking part limits, or it admits military defeat, and so it limits how much the military is willing to accept this strategy. It's a hard pill for the armed forces to swallow, and that really hasn't changed. In fact, things have gotten harder. Other circumstances, like the green on blue attacks, high-profile incidents like Camp Bastion, and the raid on the U.S. Embassy in Kabul do serious damage to the military's morale, and it contradicts previous messaging, which says that the security outlook is on track. And also, I think we should be cautious about President Karzai's flip-flopping on the issue of detainees and other circumstances that are necessary for transition to occur. They show that the environment, his flip-flopping shows that the environment is not conducive for a political solution. So it's something to pay attention to as we move forward in the transition. I also hope and believe that the transition will stay on schedule, but if the political conditions on the ground change drastically, it's going to be hard to follow that path. And the biggest, I think, environmental indicator hindering the reconciliation process right now is the U.S. election. Politicians are simply not likely to take bold steps on controversial foreign policies that could handicap themselves or their candidate of choice in the upcoming elections. So I think for this reason alone, really, any tangible gains towards the political solution are going to be on hold until after the elections. Fortunately, we don't have that much longer to wait until the elections, but it's a waiting game that President Obama is definitely playing, but one that the Taliban and other stakeholders like Pakistan also participate in. So let me just take a couple of minutes and then I'll conclude to talk about Pakistan, which I actually believe is one of the most important stakeholders in a political solution. I know it's controversial to say that, and whether we like it or not, Pakistan has a role and it's not going to go away. So I think it's best to just kind of talk about that. And in more specifics, we haven't seen a lot of specific discussion about what its role could be, what interests it has. There hasn't been a lot of honesty in this debate, and I hope that we can see that more in the future. At least now there is acknowledgement, if not acceptance, that genuine reconciliation is not possible without Pakistan's participation. But as we all know, efforts to bring Pakistan into the tent have yet to articulate that specific role. When Foreign Minister Hina Rabbani Kar was here in Washington last month, she sought to clarify some of these terms. Pakistan is always heard saying what it doesn't want. Very rarely is it heard saying what it does want in a political solution. So she sought to kind of clarify some of that. First, Pakistan supports a political solution as long as it's Afghan-led. It doesn't want to be made a scapegoat for the aftermath of the war after the U.S. transitions out, similar to how it felt after the Afghan-Soviet war. It seeks a stable government in Afghanistan. The Pakistanis used to say stable and friendly, but the friendly part has fallen off in recent months. So it doesn't necessarily have to be friendly or seen as pro-Pakistan, but stable. Doesn't want the conflict in Afghanistan to further destabilize its border areas and provoke attacks in the settled areas, which has been a huge cause of concern for the domestic population. And finally, there are still up to 2 million Afghan refugees left in Pakistan, and the government has regularly made public comments that they'd like these refugees to go back and be able to have a safe environment to go back to. These are all well-known public talking points, but it's what Pakistani officials are not saying out loud that I think is more interesting. And I'll just say it very bluntly, that Pakistan is in a bind, mostly because it lacks sufficient Afghan partners who can guarantee its security interests in Afghanistan. What are those interests? I've outlined 3 dominant ones. First is to minimize Indian influence in Afghanistan, to prevent this feeling of being strategically encircled. Second, to contain Pashtun groups in Pakistan. There's a movement for a greater Pashtunistan. There's debate over whether this is still very strong or not, but the sentiment is there, and it's there to be provoked by groups that want to cause problems for the Pakistani state. And third, to ensure stability on the Af-Pak border. Historically, the Taliban have played this role as guarantor, but goodwill between the 2 partners it's not what it used to be. It's worn thin over the past 10 years, and Pakistan's capacity to secure the border with Afghanistan is weakened by anti-state groups like the Pakistani Taliban. And then we also have India's economic development presence expanding in Afghanistan, which is a cause for concern with Pakistan. We all know that. And to manage all of this, Pakistan needs a group on the Afghanistan border that can ensure that that area doesn't become a safe haven for anti-Pakistan or pro-India groups. And the only group with enough influence to do that is the Haqqani network, which has from time to time encouraged Pashtun groups in Fatah or discouraged them from attacking Pakistan, and also kept Al-Qaeda from attacking Pakistan. 2 minutes, okay. But this relationship is a precarious one, as we've seen this unfold in recent months with the discussion of the Haqqani network and the U.S. asking Pakistan to be more aggressive against them, and Pakistan being fairly limited in what it can do. There's nothing ideological that binds the Haqqani network to Pakistan. It could turn on the government at any given moment. And for its part, Pakistan is unsure about cutting those ties because the repercussions could be severe. So in addition to making sure there's a guarantor for its security interests on the Afghanistan border, Pakistan could also face violent retribution if it cuts ties with the Haqqani network. The Pakistani Taliban in the tribal areas and in the settled areas could initiate attacks. And I think there's also a real fear of backlash within the Pakistani military itself, which has a growing problem of jihadist sympathizers among the lower ranks. So then I'll conclude with the question of, well, what would a Pakistan-relevant Afghan political solution actually address beyond what we've heard publicly? It would require some resolution of the Durand Line to delineate a clear separation between Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It would ask India to limit its engagement in Afghanistan, or at least more realistically begin a transparent dialogue with Pakistan about its involvement there. And finally, it would propose some kind of power sharing or governance arrangement to ensure that the provinces bordering Pakistan would not become safe havens for anti-Pakistan or pro-India groups. These are just a few of the examples, but they're among the most difficult, and I don't see the U.S. being the only participant in ensuring these needs are met. This is something that has to be more organic and happen in the region. The bottom line is that Pakistan has limited options, and because of this it will continue to face difficulties in articulating its interests and making its demands. It may be that the process moves along without the active participation of Pakistan, but it can't be successful without its tacit acceptance. I just want to conclude by saying that it's a disclaimer that pushing for a more visible role for Pakistan doesn't mean that it should run the show there. I recognize that it's been a major source of tension, a contributor of the conflict there. And because of that, it's only the Afghans that can actually drive a successful political solution. But as one of the most significant neighbors, Pakistan must have some kind of role.
Thank you, Shamal. Our third speaker is Arif Rafiq, who is an adjunct scholar with the Middle East Institution. He is quite well known in the media realm, a regular columnist with Pakistan's Express Tribune, which I think is perhaps the best English language paper in Pakistan, aside from Dawn. He has been a regular on a number of TV programs and writes frequently for the Christian Science Monitor, Daily Beast, Foreign Policy. So I think we'll ask now. Let me also add that he was for a time with the Saban Center at Brookings Institution. Please, Rafiq.
Thank you, Dr. Weinbaum, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this important discussion. The central question before us is whether there is a political solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. I do believe that there is a political solution. I think one is possible, but I think given the realities on the ground today, it looks increasingly improbable. Before I delve into why I'm pessimistic about the possibility of a political solution in Afghanistan, and also offer some reasons for optimism about the possibility for a political solution, I think it's important to contextualize where we are in Afghanistan and also vis-a-vis the various interest groups and the power brokers that have a stake in the future of that country. So what we see right now in Afghanistan is the slow unraveling of the Bonn framework that provided the glue that holds together Afghanistan post 9/11. If you recall, the Bonn framework is a series of agreements between a variety of Afghan interest groups, ethnic groups, and political factions that was forged in the wake of 9/11. It was encouraged by Western powers, including the United States and various European governments, and what it offered was effectively a consociational framework for governance in Afghanistan. It allowed for a political transition led by Hamid Karzai, and then subsequently, a few years later, there was a political system, a presidential system with elections and a parliament, and offered Afghans a functioning political system that had not existed for quite some time. That consociational setup was led by Karzai, who was a mild-mannered, moderate Pashtun leader from an important family that had participated in jihad. With his cape and that hat that he frequently wears, he symbolized a sort of Superman who could bring this factionalized country together. Today, he's a very divisive figure. He's derided. Some allege that he's connected to the drug trade, and his family is connected to other types of illicit criminal networks. And now, when we look at his term on power, it's coming towards an end. His presidency is scheduled to end in 2014, and it looks as if he is either trying to consolidate power or choose a successor that through which he can indirectly control the political process. At the same time, other critical elements in that Bonn framework, the other political factions that represented the warring Mujahideen groups from the 1990s, specifically from the Jamiat Islami, these groups are now against Karzai. And they're actually factionalized themselves, so there are two major factions. There's the National Front, which is led by Ahmed Zia Massoud, and also by Amrullah Saleh, who's the former head of the Afghan intelligence services. And there's also the National Council of Afghanistan, which is led by Dr. Abdullah. The National Front wants a federalist framework for Afghanistan. It wants a loose center and strong localized governance and provinces. The National Council of Afghanistan's leader, Dr. Abdullah, ran against Karzai in the last elections. They're widely agreed to, it's widely acknowledged that they were rigged. And when the next elections take place, it's really unclear as to whether these will be free and fair and what the response of Afghan power brokers will be if the result is not to their favor and if they don't believe that they're legitimate. Now the surge is over. It ended earlier this month when the last set of U.S. troops that came in after the surge finally returned home. But the insurgency continues, and violence continues at quite high levels in Afghanistan. So violence is down this year as compared to last year, but it's still at or greater levels than they were in 2010. The surge has made Afghanistan a much more violent place. Rather than weakening the Taliban, it has empowered a wide variety of militia groups. And there's been an influx of weaponry. And it's unclear as to what will happen to all those guns, material, and personnel in the coming years. Just recently, in September, there was an unregulated Tajik militia that attacked a settlement of Pashtun civilians in the area of Kunduz. It's a majority Tajik province in the north that has a sizable Pashtun presence. And so, this is possibly an ominous sign of things to come. There's been a rise in green on blue attacks. So Afghan personnel have been targeting and killing Western coalition forces that they are supposedly partnered with. The Taliban undoubtedly plays an important role in many of these attacks, but it's unclear as to whether they're involved in 10%, 25%, or 75%. It depends on one's biases and one's preferred perspective on this, but I would say that a significant amount of this is due to personal tensions between coalition forces and their Afghan partners. Now, there's a serious erosion of trust as the United States is attempting to hand off security control to their Afghan counterparts to train them and to pass the baton on to them. So the transition itself is jeopardized, and this transition is an important element to countering the Taliban and at the very least securing the north, the west, and Kabul from potentially emboldened Taliban forces. Both American U.S. presidential candidates are committed to ending combat operations in Afghanistan by 2014. And allies such as Australia, Britain, and New Zealand are rushing for the exits. And political forces domestically there are pushing for an early exit. Meanwhile, the Afghan army does not appear as if it will be able to secure their own country by 2014. So Afghanistan today remains a very violent place. Its political elite is fractured, and the foreign coalition that came in after 9/11 to secure this Afghan government, this regime, is also fractured itself. The insurgency, meanwhile, remains relatively coherent and powerful. It has a veto power over the future of Afghanistan, and it still must be recognized, though, that it itself is fractured. So there are differences between the Afghan Taliban that are led by Mullah Muhammad Omar and the Hizb Islami led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. What we've been seeing in the past year or so are some localized so-called uprisings in the areas around Kabul, and these have been led by Hizb Islami, Gulbuddin. And this is a group that is actually partnered to some degree with the Afghan with the Afghan Taliban. At the same time, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's organization launched a suicide attack in Kabul after the emergence of this anti-Islam film that was published on YouTube. So it's hedging its bets, and what that points toward is a continuation of conflict. And so what we have is a context in which there is an absence of coherence and unity in terms of the Afghan power brokers that are vested in this post-9/11 system that emerges from the Bonn framework. The insurgency itself is committed to fighting, but at the same time there is some factionalization within, and even within Mullah Muhammad Omar's organization, as to whether there should be a political settlement or whether they should go and try to take over Kabul and take over the entire country. And then the NATO-led, the U.S.-led coalition itself is also fractured. So, you have this divisiveness that permeates across the spectrum in Afghanistan and the power brokers that are vested in that country. And so within that context, it makes it very difficult for any sort of political settlement to be achieved. Now, with the end of the surge, I think the United States has lost the best opportunity to achieve a political settlement. Its greatest leverage was manifested by the greatest force potential there. Now those forces are gone. There's about 68,000 troops left. And in between now and 2014, presumably there will be withdrawal of some forces. And so that force power will be reduced even more. The hope was that at the last Bonn meeting, the second Bonn meeting, it occurred in December of 2011, that the Taliban and Pakistan would partake in a meaningful fashion to bring these entities, in particular the Taliban, into this political framework, and that did not take place. Exploratory talks between the United States and the Taliban have stalled since March, and these were exploratory talks, not even talks about substantive issues. They were designed to create confidence between these two major interest groups. And so the United States and the Taliban have yet to really discuss the tough issues that surround an actual political settlement in Afghanistan. And that's a prerequisite for Afghan power brokers to begin those negotiations themselves, because the Taliban have said that they will first engage with the United States, and then possibly next they will engage with a broad spectrum of Afghan power brokers. Now, there have been some talks in Japan that occurred sometime this year, and so it's unclear as to which Taliban participated, but what that does suggest is that there is some willingness to talk, but still there are a wide variety of issues that have not been discussed in any meaningful fashion. And so, for example, is Mullah Omar ready to, he has declared himself Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful. How is that absolute position going to be integrated into a democratic framework? The Taliban say one of their major demands is that they want an Islamic system. They want Islamic law to govern Afghanistan. Well, we already see that to some extent. Afghanistan today is not the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. It is the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. So Islam plays some role in the legislation of Afghanistan. So where does the Taliban want to, what role should Islam play? Should it be the role of Islam as manifested in the 1990s, or is there going to be some sort of hybrid framework? Those issues have not been dealt with. Will the Taliban participate in elections? Are elections permissible? The Taliban have yet to really, give any indication that they're capable or even interested in operating in a political fashion. Now, I only have about a minute left, so I'll just go through quickly some reasons for optimism. As Shamila had noted, Pakistan in a sense has the upper hand in terms of what's going on now, but at the same time there are some weaknesses that can be exploited by individuals or entities that want a political settlement. Pakistan, just today, for example, Malala Yousafzai, who's a young woman activist, 14 years old, there was an attempted assassination on her in Swat. Swat is a settled area that was home to a major insurgency that ran from 2006 to 2010 or 2009. Now, that area is significantly impacted by these insurgent territories in Kunar, in the border areas between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Pakistani Taliban has safe havens there. They use that territory to operate in Bajor and Dir, and then they spread deeper into Swat. And this is an area where the Pakistani army has invested probably its unprecedented amount of resources in terms of a counterinsurgency. It's lost a lot of lives, expended a lot of money and political capital in terms of stabilizing this area. And instability in Afghanistan in those border areas jeopardizes the gains that Pakistan has achieved in Swat and elsewhere. Now, if that area is not stabilized, what do you think will happen when the 68,000 U.S. troops leave Afghanistan? Pakistan needs those U.S. troops to balance out things in Afghanistan so it can have a more favorable context on its side of the Durand line. So it's dependent on the U.S. to balance out some of the uncontrollable extremist entities inside Afghanistan. These are Taliban organizations that are more tied to Al-Qaeda than the central Taliban organization, and they operate on both sides of the Durand Line. So Pakistan is interested, I think, in a negotiated settlement, but a negotiated settlement that is on its terms. And so this is a fight about leverage, and I think it's a step forward that Pakistan has been involved in what's essentially a trilateral framework involving Kabul and Washington. There's been the formation of a safe passage working group in which the three governments decide which Taliban members are allowed to move freely so as to partake in peace negotiations. And also now they're engaged in talks to also explore what sort of red lines the Taliban or what's the bottom line for the Taliban in the negotiation process, and what do they actually want to achieve, and how can we actually achieve a negotiated settlement instead of talking about prisoners. Maybe we can actually begin talking about what an actual endgame will look like. And then finally, Afghans are capable. I think there's people tend to emphasize the role of external powers in terms of achieving a political settlement, but Afghans are definitely capable of discussing and determining the future of their own country. One of the greatest achievements of the United States post 9/11 has been its assistance in terms of forming and enabling an Afghan parliament that has engaged in vibrant discussion and has actually tried to weaken the powers of the presidency. It's a coherent organization, represents a significant power bloc, and they discuss a wide variety of issues. It's not exactly the most effective institution in the world, but we can say the same thing for the Congress here in the United States. But there have been marked changes in Afghanistan post 9/11, but at the same time, I think the clock is ticking. Time is running out for me right now, but time is also running out for the power brokers that want political settlement. There's about 2 years left, and that substantive discussion has yet to have taken place, and it occurs in a time of political transition in Washington, Kabul, and Islamabad, and as the political communities there are increasingly fracturing. So on that note, thank you.
Thank you, Arif. We have about 30 minutes for questions. Let me just ask first, if I may, with the United States and its NATO partners promising to be largely, not entirely, out of the country by the end of 2014, given the fact that the Taliban have not been defeated militarily, what now in the foreseeable future would be the incentive for the Taliban to do other than say, well, let's see where this goes? Isn't this likely to lead to the collapse of this government? Isn't this going to be an opportunity which is rich in possibilities come the end of 14, if not sooner, certainly then after? So why if you were part of the Taliban leadership, would you hesitate at all to make any serious compromises in this interim period? We'll start with Omar.
Thanks. It's a good question and a difficult one to answer, but what I can say first of all is that I do not believe that the Taliban follow just one line of thought. There is a hardcore Taliban leadership which decides under the name of the Taliban and holds power and decision-making, resources, political and military authority. But from, again, an Afghan perspective, there are looser Taliban groupings that would probably prefer to enter into some type of negotiation with other Afghans. These groupings have been under tremendous pressure in Pakistan. Some of the leaders of those elements who have shown an inclination to talk and maybe negotiate have either disappeared, have been killed, or have just, been sidelined. We have many names in this category of people, and this shows us, this demonstrates some disagreement within the Taliban, and what we also see is that at any point when a certain person goes and speaks on behalf of the Taliban or under the name of the Taliban with Germans or Americans or either other Afghans or in Arab countries, very quickly they are described as not true Taliban by this hardcore that resides in Pakistan, between Quetta and Peshawar, and some of them in Karachi. So the incentive, getting back to your question, the incentive would be, first of all, to allow the Taliban, if the Taliban really want, if some Taliban want peace, to allow them to come out and to hear them out, to see what it is that they want. We, other Afghans, and this has nothing to do with the Pashtun, non-Pashtun issue. Most of the Afghan government today is run by Pashtuns, by the way. The fact that Afghans are unable to talk to other Afghans who happen to be Taliban is a major problem for us. And so we are looking at Pakistan, I think the US is also looking at Pakistan, to open a door for these contacts to take place, so that at the least we could figure out what it is that they want, what it is that they're able to do, what it is that they're able to negotiate on, and how far can they come. We are not even at that stage. We are very far from that. We're at the very beginnings of talks about talks, and every door that we try to open is then shut. So this is why the role of Pakistan may be important, but if the role of Pakistan is to use leverage for its own agenda, then we're not going to get anywhere. But if the role of Pakistan is to be more constructive and more helpful to everyone, including itself, to allow for a genuine Afghan-led, Afghan sort of inspired peace process, then I think that we can reach a mutually beneficial, mutually useful approach. But at this point, it seems that everyone is trying to open a door, and then the other side, pretending that they are talking about talks, are actually shutting it down. So we need to figure out exactly what it is. And so this leads to people thinking that this is a tactic, and the strategy is actually to buy time, to prolong this as much as possible, to get closer to 2014, and meanwhile use psychological warfare on the Afghans, on the Western public opinion, to basically tell everyone the Taliban are coming, the Taliban will take power, Afghanistan is going to collapse, you're losing, you're leaving, and this in itself can become psychologically can accelerate the situation. But it's not going to solve the problem. It's going to, if the Taliban think that they will be able to capture Kabul and recreate the emirate that they had set up between 1996 and 2001, I think that they will be in for a big surprise. I think that not only do the Afghans overwhelmingly reject that formula, but that there are many others in that region of the world and beyond who also do not ascribe to this. And I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be detrimental to Pakistani interests as well, and to Pakistani security.
I want to get to the questions, but I'll give Shamila an opportunity.
Shamila, thanks. Two quick things. Well, one, I think logically it's fair to presume that there's no incentive for the Taliban. We've given them a timetable, so they'll just wait. But one important thing to remember is that the Taliban will still need international recognition and legitimacy in order to govern or be in some kind of political role in Afghanistan after 2014. This is precisely the reason why they've asked, as a confidence-building measure, to have the U.S. recognize a political office outside of Afghanistan. It transforms them from a terrorist organization into a political party, essentially. I mean, this is kind of 101 with negotiations. So the Taliban's not going to be able to come back and have any kind of power without international legitimacy. And it's something that they're concerned about. We know that after 9/11, the parts of the leadership were concerned that this was the bad route for the Taliban to go to harbor al-Qaeda. They should turn them in because it damages their goal to establish international legitimacy. So I think that still holds. The other thing is that I think that there's space there, going back to the Pakistan issue, the Taliban, their families, they're not as happy as people think living in Pakistan. They don't want to be under the Pakistani thumb anymore. It's not a comfortable environment for them. And then the third point I want to make is that when I think it was in March or earlier this year, there was a lot of public discussion of opening up a political office in Qatar. And when that happened, what the Taliban leadership saw was lower level, mid-level commanders started turning in their weapons to NATO field commanders because they thought that the leadership had made a deal without them. And they were willing to negotiate and they were willing to compromise because they thought others had their own interests at heart and weren't considering them. To me, this actually means that not only are there fissures in the movement, it's not unified, and you can break off parts of it who are more amenable to a political solution than others.
Well, I mean, I agree with Shamila that international legitimacy is a major incentive for the Taliban to pursue a negotiated settlement. That's what they lacked in the 1990s, and if they attain that today, that would mean that they would run or partake in an Afghanistan that is supplied with greater resources from the international community than it had in the 1990s. But at the same time, I'm not quite sure as to how the senior leadership, in particular Mullah Omar, has changed since the 1990s. So back then, there were numerous instances in which the Pakistani intelligence services and military leaders went and visited Mullah Omar or other leaders with the Taliban, asked them to do certain things such as hand over Osama bin Laden, and they were resistant. So that level of obstinacy it's unclear as to whether that's changed. Publicly, they're definitely try to put on a better public face and make themselves appear as if they're simply focused on Afghanistan, they're a national resistance movement, and want to integrate all ethnic power brokers into a unified national framework. But it's really unclear as to, one, whether the senior leadership has changed, and two, whether it can make these compromises and still cohere as an organization. It's perhaps the case that Mullah Omar could simply let the clock run out and in the end lack the courage to make compromises that could challenge his hold on the organization, because he might see that the risk of opting for compromise is greater than making no choice at all.
Thank you. Floor, please identify yourself and keep your question as brief as possible. Back here first.
Thank you. Bill Goodfellow of the Center for International Policy. I think one of the obstacles to a political settlement, there are many, is the fact that in Afghanistan the U.S. military is still in control and still fighting to defeat the Taliban, fighting for a military victory. And I think until the State Department, until the diplomats are put in control and the military steps back, and that's a failure of Washington, that we'll just sort of wander along and really make very little progress. I'd like to see if anybody agrees with me.
I agree with you. I think the whole fight, talk, build strategy is a confusing one, but I don't want to compare this war to other wars because it's very unique in some ways, but it's gone on for so long that private discussions I've had with colleagues lead us to the conclusion that we can't fight and talk. We have to just talk at this point. And it struck me when I was at the NSC and I went to the region to talk to Pakistanis and Afghans, part of the political establishment, that they were also saying the same thing, that there was no, the fighting and the military being in Afghanistan, it's a means to achieve a particular end. It's not an end on its own. And what has happened is that it's become that. The military is there for the sake of its own interests, in a way. And there's, and I think some of my former colleagues might not be happy with me saying this, but there's an amount of hubris that's associated with it. If we under-resourced the war pre-2008 and then we over-resourced it, how come we're still in the position that we're in? So clearly it was not an issue of manpower or money. It's another issue, and we still haven't answered that question. I think that's kind of the problem, is if you admit that the military solution is not possible, we still don't have answers, as you can see, to what the political solution would look like. It's very complex. So in a nutshell, I agree with you.
Since there's no one here to speak for the military, let me just quickly take a stab at that. The military has said that it is not against a political solution. They've claimed that it's a question here of whether the timing is right. They argue that the conditions are such that there's no reason to expect that there would be a military solution. But they would accept the proposition that you can't, that the idea that we're going to win militarily as such alone without a political dimension to it is unrealistic. They would argue on the other side that there's every indication that there are people in the Taliban who still believe in a military solution. At least that's the argument. So let me, this gentleman here.
Daniel Barr with Center for American Progress. How do you address the insecurities of the Tajiks and the Uzbeks who hear that there's going to be reconciliation with the Taliban and they think that they're going to be marginalized
Sure. Well, I think...
I'll come back.
Okay. Well, I think Ambassador Summit is probably better qualified to answer this question, but...
I'm neither one.
Yeah. But you are an Afghan, so that is important. And but I would say, in addition to the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, the Hazaras are probably the most precarious, the group that is in the most precarious situation in Afghanistan. They're both, Shias in terms of their religious affinity. They're also probably the most marginalized group in Afghanistan, and their gains post 9/11 have probably been the greatest. In some standardized testing in Afghanistan for universities and things like that, they tend to place the highest out of all ethnic groups. They've joined the military. They have a sizable voice in parliament, and many of them are now reside in Kabul, and so they're not in this sort of this empty zone in the central of the country. So they've gone from the periphery to the central. How do we address those concerns? That's not a concern. The Taliban and any entity that's involved in the negotiation process will have to address those concerns, and they will involve, ensuring that I think militias and other entities that are weaponized and not connected to the state are contained to some degree, and so that there won't be a purge of Hazaras and Shias from the state apparatus, from the military. For Tajiks and Uzbeks, I think they're probably in a better position to hold their own, just because of their physical location, size, and presence inside the government. But it's probably Hazaras that are probably in the most difficult position, and it will require other ethnic groups standing up for them, and also for foreign actors such as the United States and Pakistan to be cognizant of their interests and the potential security threats that they face from an emboldened Taliban.
If I may add, first of all, I would like to say that I think post 9/11, all Afghan groups and all Afghan social and ethnic groupings have benefited from the changes that have taken place in Afghanistan. Now, if you really look at the indicators and statistics, it's not really a question of ethnicity. It's a question of how, to what degree you are free to exercise your rights, to live under, this sort of weak governing system that has evolved in Afghanistan, or to what extent you are under the influence and under the pressures brought upon by the Taliban and armed groups. And not just Taliban. I have to say that there are also some illegal armed groups in the country, some warlords who are in other types of businesses, have other interests, who want to undermine the state. So Afghans living in any part of the country under those types of pressures, of course, feel left out. But those who are not under those types of pressures, or feel less pressure, have been able to benefit from the huge amounts of money that have come into Afghanistan, the development work, schools, clinics, all of these things opening, because not everything in Afghanistan is bleak, and especially in terms of feeling included in the political process and empowered by the political process. So, as far as the minorities are concerned, because Afghanistan has not had a census, an official scientific census, unfortunately, and something that should have been done by now. We do not really actually have accurate figures concerning the breakup of the ethnic groups. We do know that the Pashtuns are the largest group. They may not be the majority group, but they're the largest group, followed by the Tajiks, Uzbeks, Hazaras, and others. But the minorities would like to live alongside everybody else, and I am absolutely certain that the Pashtuns of Afghanistan would like to live alongside everybody else in this piece of real estate we call Afghanistan. They have done so for thousands of years, as I tried to explain to you earlier, with very little problems among them. So what we are seeing is mostly artificial and things that have evolved as a result of other agendas over the last 30-something years. So if you let Afghans, peacefully deciding their own destiny, they will do it. They have shown that they have that ability and that desire to do so. They may have quarrels over things, but those are very normal internal domestic issues that they can handle themselves. What they are afraid of is that another group would use ethnicity as a slogan and would use Islam as a slogan as well, and come and impose its will and its recipe on the rest of the country, including the Pashtuns of Afghanistan. That, to all Afghans who do not prescribe to the Taliban mindset, is unacceptable. And I think that this is where we have an opportunity. Both Afghans have an opportunity to regroup around some shared values and shared interests, and those who have helped us encourage us to do so and agree that Afghans have that capability and that desire to do so. And this in itself would be a major obstacle to any type of radicalism or extremism. And I'm not just picking on the Taliban type, I'm picking on any type of extremism coming and trying to impose its will on Afghanistan, because we're also facing other types of extremism. I mean, Iran is not playing a very constructive role either in Afghanistan. And so we need to find solutions that are Afghan bred and Afghan sourced.
Dan?
I too would like to be optimistic, but an awful lot of what you've said suggests to me that we're seeing the birth of Pashtunistan. Are we seeing the birth of a new nation that crosses the Pakistan-Afghanistan border?
I do not know if that will happen or not. I don't think anybody can. But if the trend is toward the breakup of Pakistan and Afghanistan into a Pashtun land, it will not be Pashtunistan. It will be Talibistan, and that you have to be careful about.
I don't think so. I think there is. I mean, of course, anything is possible, like the ambassador said. I hope not, but I don't think so, because there's. In both countries, there's still institutions in place that have very specific interests at stake, and they may not be working together towards, collaborating better or cooperating better, but they are aware of the situation. I mean, if you go to the region and you talk to officials, they're very scared. There's a sense of instability. They're aware of what post-2014 could unleash. And it's not just a waiting game for everyone. I mean, they know that they have to act, otherwise it's going to be back to the 90s. So I think there's an awareness that's there which will prevent that type of situation. But over the long term, this is going to be very difficult to prevent. There's a crisis of governance going on. Pakistan's traditional strategy of having these ungoverned spaces on the border no longer works because there are these groups there that are against the state now. The traditional strategy of using proxies writ large, we don't know how that's going to be implemented or addressed post-2014. And that you have to consider the role of external stakeholders, not just Iran, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's many countries that have been mucking around in Afghanistan that have contributed to the situation, and maybe those strategies will change too. I mean, I think there's just a lot of unknowns in terms of what to do, but there is this general awareness of what could happen, and they don't want it to be like the 90s.
All the way in the rear there.
Mr. Fordier with the United Nations. Ambassador, do you think any further consolidation of the Afghan states is possible without political settlement?
I think that the prerequisite to further consolidation of state in Afghanistan first rests on better governance and on better leadership. Then we can talk about who is and who isn't part of it and how it can come about. Because if the political system is solid and can offer better alternatives and better choices to the Afghans, I think that even some Taliban will agree to join and lay down arms. One of the reasons why people are fighting is because the Afghan government has not delivered and has been weak and has been corrupt, and especially in terms of rendering justice. Our judicial system has been dysfunctional, and all the efforts and the investments made over the last 11 years have not really amounted to much, and so there's a distrust on the part of rural Afghanistan and urban Afghanistan and the judicial system. So I think that good governance is going to help consolidate the state, and of course reconciliation, as I said, it's a question of those who are fighting, regardless of what their motivation may be. As I said, you know, there's the hardcore who are motivated by jihad. Regardless of what you do, they'll continue fighting for one reason or another. Unfortunately, that is reality for some. Then there are others who are motivated by money and economic prospects and a salary. Then there are those who are motivated by the ethnic sort of attraction, and they feel the bonding, that the ethnic bonding sort of encourages them to be part of this. And then there's a mixture of, and then there are those who are dissatisfied with the Afghan government and with the international community, with civilian death, with injustice, with corruption, and so on and so forth. So we need to address each one as part of a whole overall strategy. And each one is a very big piece and a very difficult piece to handle. But at the end of the day, the objective should be to strengthen the state. Strengthening the state does not mean strengthening the powers of the president, for example, which is what Mr. Karzai is thinking. He thinks that strengthening the state equals strengthening the president, the presidency. Afghans have to find a more realistic and more practical manner that that creates that balance that used to exist in the past as well between the center and the periphery. And so this is a huge issue in political Afghanistan today as to how to rebalance this. And I think that those are the elements that will help with consolidation of state, but a state that functions for the Afghans in the Afghan context, not in the classical context or the Western context.
Well, let me remind you that there is a difference between reconciliation and reintegration. That much of what the ambassador has spoken about can be encompassed within the idea of reintegration, where you don't have a big deal. You don't have a major treaty or agreement which is negotiated at the highest levels, but that you have conditions laid where you are able to address these kinds of grievances. You're able to address those who are fighting for non-ideological reasons, those who are fighting for monetary reasons, indeed. So that it's important to make that distinction here. Much of our discussion has been about the deal, the big overarching agreement. There are many who would say that even were that not possible, that doesn't mean that you couldn't have many agreements which would be of reconciliation. Many agreements. This gentleman here. We have a microphone. Wait for the microphone.
My name is Gausi, and one question for Mr. Rafik. My point of clarification is, you talk about international recognition. These are Western concepts, which means nothing to the Taliban. We have a clinic run by the Gausi family, who are medical doctor in California and medical doctor in Germany. We have established a clinic in Logar, where the Taliban are very active. You cannot go there until some Taliban who round the area will not permit to go from Kabul to Logar. And the position of the Taliban was very clear, anti-Karzai and against the presence of foreign participants. The real core of the Taliban have not come to discussion. My question from Mr. Rafik is said that Karzai will choose a successor. Choose is the right word. And secondly, it seems to me that when you mentioned the Afrasiab, Khatak and Yousafzai, please clarify the Konar affair, the silence of the Kabul government, and the wrong intervention of Zalmay Masood and the UN Security Council. Thank you.
Thanks. There were a couple of questions there, and I'll try to answer some of them and address some of your comments. Your first point about the Taliban rank and file being unconcerned with international legitimacy, and I agree with that. What you have is a factual... Right, yeah, and I just want to let you know that I agree with you, and that there is a difference between the rank and file and how they perceive their agenda, their mission, and the leadership core of the organization, which might have a more nuanced perspective, and they're looking at the big picture game as opposed to the local on-the-ground game, where they want to dominate over the government, and they feel that they're the sole legitimate force on the ground. Now, you asked me to clarify in respect to Malala Yousafzai? Yes. So, the question is, there will be elections in 2014 or possibly even earlier in 2013. Karzai is making changes to the political system in the country. He's, sacking some governors, appointing some new ones, and at the same time, there's a question of the election commission. Who will run it? Will the elections be fair? Will a member of his family or somebody who is tied to his family be given certain privileges that will basically result in them winning the election and allowing him to continue to be in power in some shape or form indirectly, or to at the very least secure his and his family's interests? And so I think that's definitely a possibility. It's a concern that many Afghans have expressed, and I think that's something that has to be dealt with during the negotiation process. And so, you're having a change, a transition in government in Afghanistan, and at the same time, the Taliban leadership has to negotiate with this entity. So it's like, two moving vehicles at the same time trying to, pass a note to each other or something like that. It's difficult to coordinate. And then you asked about Afrasiab Khatak and Malala Yousafzai, I think. I didn't understand your question.
Yeah, we're really running. I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. Okay. So I'm going to. Omar, you want to?
Just about this young girl who was attacked. I fail to see the connection to Konar, even though we know that some SWAT militants are said to have moved into Afghanistan. But this just happened a few hours ago. I'm not sure what the relationship is with the Konar situation, because I could give you the example. This morning I read that piece, which was very troubling, to see this young girl being attacked in SWAT. And then I also read another piece where two Afghan children aged 6 or 7 or so were killed in front of their father because their father had refused to join the Taliban. So you can't. I mean, what we have been saying in Afghanistan is, you can call them Pakistani Taliban, you can call them Haqqani, you can call them Hikmatyar, you can call them Mullah Omar. As far as we are concerned, they come from the same schooling. They believe in the same objectives, political, and their worldview is the same. They want to create the same institutions and gain power through the same means. This is not rocket science. We have been dealing with Taliban since 1994. There was nothing called the Taliban prior to this. There were mujahideen of different stripes who fought the Soviets and so on in the Civil War. And then the Taliban emerged as a result of the chaos. And then we know how they were embraced and so on and so forth, and who supported them. And to this day, there's nobody in Afghanistan who thinks that there is much difference between Mullah Omar or some Pakistani Taliban leader. Some of them are anti-state, and some of them are anti-US, but at the end of the day, they all want the same thing. They killed a 12-year-old Pakistani girl, and they killed the 2 Afghan children on this side of the border. No difference. So this is the message that we were trying to convey to Islamabad. You need to wake up before your children get killed like our children have been killed for the past years. You need to, if you want a democratic future, if you want development, if you want, and I'm sorry, this is not against, this is not towards you, but if Pakistan wants, Pakistan keeps pointing at India. Well, India has thousands of years of history with Afghanistan, a relationship with Afghanistan. And India's role today in Afghanistan is as a soft power broker, not as a hard power broker. We will not allow India to have a hard power brokerage role in Afghanistan. We know how sensitive Islamabad is to this. I have sat in meetings with General Musharraf has told President Karzai, Indians have 24 consulates run by intelligence services against Pakistan in Afghanistan. And at the end of the day, they had the same number of consulates as Pakistan. The truth was, but General Musharraf, the head of state of Pakistan, is telling the head of state of Afghanistan there are 24. Where's this information coming from? Where's this disinformation coming from? So we are dealing with something much more serious, than saying, well, this Taliban may be good and that Taliban may be bad. It's the future of your society. It's the future of especially what you call the youth bulge. In a globalized society, in a networked world, who want something different, but who have to face a force that is trying to stop progress and take them backwards. We are facing the same challenge and the same adversary. You think that it's a strategic asset, we think that it's a strategic suicide.
Well, we really have run over our allotted time. The last set of remarks here leave us with the feeling that maybe there's something more existential involved here, in that the idea that this is simply a matter of tactically working out an arrangement is perhaps, well, at least going to be extraordinarily difficult. If we thought it was difficult before we came here, I'm sure we'll go away feeling even more so. But I want to thank the members of the panel for giving us a context. And I think it wasn't simply a discussion of will it happen, can it happen, but really providing a larger context in which, in the short term at least, I don't personally think that there's a great deal of reason for optimism. But I come out of this, as perhaps you do, with a sense that on the larger scene here is one which is amenable to compromise, that here are people who ultimately can live together. The mechanism that's going to make that possible, I think, for the time being at least, eludes us. Thank you.